News of the Times. The murder of Mr. Blight. A betrayal most foul. Welcome to News of the Times. When respectable solicitor Mr. Blight is found murdered in his own home, the town of Devonport reels in disbelief. But what begins as a shocking act of violence soon unfurls into a tale of betrayal, scandal, and a suspect who vanished before the ink was dry on the arrest warrant. Now, was this a robbery gone wrong, or something far more sinister? From courtroom revelations to whispers in alleyways, this is a story of deception most dark, complete with false names, missing money, and a young man with everything to hide. And in today's end of episode further particulars, we travel back to 1777, a year best remembered not for that American rebellion debacle fallout, but for a woman who impersonated a man and married 3 separate wives, a different kind of revolution altogether. Now, before you dash off to don a disguise and marry 3 unsuspecting fishwives, might we entreat you most civilly to perform the sacred rites of modern engagement? Click, like, subscribe, and share this episode with your local magistrate, a trusted apothecary, and that one cousin who's probably committed fraud, but in a charming way. Failure to comply will result in you being sentenced to 1/4 hour of pillorying at Charing Cross, where you shall be pelted with overripe gooseberries and the harsh judgment of widows. Do the honourable thing, at least the fashionable, scandalous one. And now, on with the show. Background. Isaac Blight was, by all accounts, a respectable and well-known figure in the Rotherhithe district. Formerly a ship's chandler by trade, he had once owned his own business, described as prosperous, before retiring and taking on the quieter role of dockyard timekeeper. Residing in Paradise Street, he was in his late 60s at the time of his death, and well regarded in the community. Blight's life, although modest in retirement, was marked by industry, routine, and a continued interest in the affairs of the Docklands. He was said to be on friendly terms with many of his neighbours and former associates, and his past dealings seemed to leave no particular trail of enemies or scandal. In fact, this makes the violent circumstances of his death all the more shocking. No feud, no known quarrel. But perhaps the most unusual was his relationship with a man named Patch, a younger associate of unclear role, sometimes described as a protégé, sometimes merely a boarder, and soon will become apparent their connection was more complicated than it seemed, and far more dangerous. Richard Patch was, on the surface, an ordinary working man, married with children and once employed at the London docks. But by the time of the events in question, Patch's life had grown increasingly threadbare. He had not held steady employment for some time and was frequently seen trying to borrow small sums, most often from Isaac Blight himself. The 2 men were well acquainted. Patch had worked on and off for Blight and knew his habits intimately. Witnesses would later describe a man grown desperate, his mood dark, his finances dire, and his stories increasingly contradictory. While no history of violence was mentioned, Patch's erratic behaviour, shifting alibis, and efforts to erase all traces of blood from his clothes paint a portrait of a man who, when backed into a corner, took a fatal step he could never undo. It was a case that gripped the capital and rapidly spread across England. Extraordinary not just for its brutality, but for the seeming absurdity of it all. An elderly businessman shot in the chest in his own house. The assailant, a man he had known for years, a man who had taken his tea, broken his bread, and, on the surface, seemed little more than a down-on-his-luck debtor. But behind that familiarity lurked betrayal, and as the public clamoured for details, the newspapers obliged. From the London Courier and Evening Gazette, the 25th of September, 1805, extraordinary murder. On Monday night last, Mr. Isaac Blight, a most respectable and opulent merchant, was murdered while he was sitting in his chair in his own house at Greenland Dock, near Deptford. Mr. Blight's house is the first below Greenland Dock. The back part is surrounded by a strong paling. On Thursday night last, at which time Mr. Blight with his lady were at Margate, a friend of theirs, a Mr. Patch, was sitting alone in the front parlour in Mr. Blight's house. At about 8:30, he was alarmed by a pistol or a gun loaded with ball being fired through the window. The ball lodged not far from where he sat. Every search was immediately made, but no person that could be suspected was to be found. The next day, Friday, Mr. Patch wrote to Mr. Blight to inform him of the circumstance, whereby Mr. Blight instantly came to town, but neither he nor Patch could attach suspicion upon anyone. On Monday night, these gentlemen were seen sitting together in a back parlour in Mr. Blight's house, and about the same hour, 8:30, Mr. Patch, having occasion to go out for a few minutes, took a candle and left his friend alone. He had not been gone more than 2 or 3 minutes when he heard the report of a gun, on which he immediately returned and found Mr. Blight shot through the body. The ball had entered a little below his ribs, passed through his back, and remained in the waistcoating behind where he sat. The only person in the house when the murder was committed was a female servant, who also heard the riposte of the piece, but was in a kitchen at some distance. Neither Mr. Patch, the servant, nor those who were called in could find any traces whatsoever of the murderer. Neither gun nor pistol was left behind, nor anything that could tend in the least to discover him. The unfortunate gentleman was instantly put to bed, and the assistance of a surgeon was immediately procured, who soon pronounced the wound to be mortal. Mr. Blight, during the night and yesterday morning, was sufficiently collected to be able to answer every question relative to the horrid transaction. The whole account, however, that he could give was extremely short. He stated, but after Mr. Patch left him, he sat alone and neither heard nor suspected anyone. At last, however, he saw the door of the room open slowly, but this did not alarm him, and almost at the same instant he was shot. He neither saw nor heard the person who fired at him. The above particulars Mr. Blight repeated distinctly several times before he died, and declared that he was not conscious of having an enemy in the world. He expired at 3 p.m. yesterday afternoon. The deceased was on the point of retiring from business. Mr. Blight had not returned from Margate at 8 o'clock yesterday evening. The shocking death of Mr. Blight drew instant public scrutiny, and the newspapers wasted no time. With the ink barely dry on the coroner's inquest, The British press offered one of the first detailed accounts, relaying the initial witness statements and the earliest version of events. What emerged was a picture of confusion, candlelight, and a privy trip that would become central to the entire case. From the British press, the 26th of September, 1805, Coroner's Inquests. The coroner of Surrey convened an inquest at the Acorn public house near Greenland Dock following the fatal shooting of Mr. Isaac Blight. The body and premises were inspected and testimony was taken from several witnesses. Hester Kitchener, servant in the Blight household, stated that both Mrs. Blight and the children were at Margate. Mr. Blight had joined them briefly on Thursday, leaving Mr. Patch, the foreman, at home. That evening, Patch shuttered the windows early and later showed her a bullet hole, claimed someone had shot at him. On Monday, Mr. Blight returned. After tea with Patch, the two sat in the back parlour. At around 8:30, Patch told Hester he felt unwell and went out through the yard to the privy. Moments later, she heard a gunshot. Mr. Blight staggered into the kitchen, declaring he had been shot. Patch appeared almost instantly from the yard, adjusting his trousers and claiming ignorance. Hester swore that there had not been time for anyone else to approach or flee the scene. Robert Patch testified that he had recently purchased the business and house from Mr. Blight, who agreed to remain on the premises to help renew the lease. Patch described both the attempted shooting on Thursday and the fatal shot on Monday. He claimed to have been in the privy when the gun was fired. He suggested that Mr. Blight had two known enemies, a man named Webster and a waterman named Clark. The coroner surmised the evidence. The jury returned a verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown. With Mr. Blight dead and suspicion thick in the air, the question remained what exactly happened in those final moments, and was Patch truly where he claimed to be? Servant testimony, dying words, and a curiously quick return from the privy began to form a narrative that no amount of trouser hoisting could easily explain. From the Morning Post, the 26th of September, 1805. Murder of Mr. Blight. Yesterday, at about 11 o'clock, Mr. Jemmett, coroner of the county of Surrey, held an inquest at the sign of the Acorn in Rotherhithe on the body of Isaac Blight, who had been shot in his parlour. Hester Hitchener, servant to the deceased, stated that Mr. Blight had returned from Margate on Monday, and that evening, after tea with Richard Patch, he asked for a candle and the key to the counting house, saying he had a pain in his bowels. She heard him walk across the floor into the privy. Almost instantly there was the report of a pistol. She screamed before she could move. Mr. Blight staggered into the kitchen, leaning against the dresser, and exclaimed, "I am a dead man." She went to shut the street door and, returning, heard knocking. Opening the parlour door, she found Patch holding up his breeches and exclaiming, "My dear Mr. Blight." He helped the wounded man into the parlour and asked Hitchener to fetch a surgeon. She hesitated from fear, but eventually called Mr. Jones, who later returned with Mr. Astley Cooper from London. Upon questioning, Hitchener estimated no more than 2 minutes passed between Patch's departure and the shot. Mr. Blight never expressed suspicion toward anyone and was always friendly with Patch. Mr. Frost, a publican, was called by Patch. Hitchener told him, "My master is done for. The villains have shot him." When Patch asked if he suspected anyone, Blight named a man called Webster, with whom he had previously quarrelled. Mr. Jones, the surgeon, confirmed the bullet entered the belly, passed through the colon and duodenum, and it exited at the back, a necessary fatal wound. He also saw 2 empty pistol cases in the parlour. Birch, a bricklayer, found a pistol ramrod in the privy. Richard Patch testified that he had purchased the lease and stock of Mr. Blight's business. He repeated the account of the pistol shot fired on the previous Thursday while he was alone in the parlour. After that incident, he recommended hiring a watchman, but Mr. Blight dismissed the idea, saying it was probably a chance shot from the river. The coroner summed up, and the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown. Mr. Blight was well respected in the neighbourhood. His sudden death caused much alarm. His widow and children were still at Margate. Mr. Jones recalled Mr. Blight saying, "Dear doctor, it's of no use. I'm done for." As whispers turned to accusations, Patch's story began to fray at the seams. The final examination before the magistrates would dig deeper, not just into the timeline of that fateful evening, but into the tangled finances, forged drafts, and suspicious behaviour that had followed. And through it all, Patch remained calm. Far too calm. From the Bell's Weekly Messenger, the 20th of October, 1805. Final examination of Mr. Patch on suspicion of murder. Bow Street. On Wednesday, the evidence from the private examinations in the case against Mr. Richard Patch, charged with the wilful murder of Mr. Isaac Blight, was read out before Sir Richard Ford and Mr. Graham. Anne Louisa Davis testified that on the evening of the 19th of September, as she passed Mr. Blight's house, she heard a gunshot. No one exited the premises while she and her sister, Mary Elizabeth Davis, were present. Both confirmed the report occurred between 8 and 9 o'clock. Michael Wright also heard the shot and saw Mr. Patch at the gateway shortly after. The financial testimony. Testimony that turned to financial matters. Patch had agreed to pay £1,250 for a third share in Mr. Blight's shipbreaking business, but had only paid £250, value approximately £28,500, out of the expected £144,000. Mr. Blight suspected fraud and wrote of his concerns to his wife. Patch falsely claimed to have deposited £1,000 at a bank, but this was untrue. Mr. Groom, the alleged payee of Patch's forged bill, confirmed he had neither authorised nor received any such funds. Mrs. Blight stated that Patch originally worked for food and lodging and was later hired at £40 a year and eventually paid £1 18 and 4 per week. Patch had offered a bill for £1,000, but it remained unpaid. Mr. Blight, frustrated by the deception, discussed the matter with his associate, Mr. Thomas Graham, who heard Blight confront Patch and later express his suspicion. Hester Kitchener, the maid, repeated her earlier statement. Patch asked for a candle and the key to the counting house, claiming bowel trouble. She heard the privy door close and almost immediately a gunshot. Mr. Blight staggered into the kitchen, crying, "I am a dead man." Patch arrived shortly after, requesting surgical help, and urged her to say she had heard him in the privy at the time of the shot. She refused to deviate from her original testimony. Mr. Jones, the surgeon, stated the wound was immediately fatal, and Patch initially claimed to own no firearms or ammunition. However, 2 empty pistol cases were seen in the parlour, and a pistol ramrod was found in the Privy soil, still clean, suggesting no recent use of the facility. Richard March, a labourer, confirmed finding the clean pistol ramrod in the Privy and noted there were no signs of illness in the soil. Patch was later overheard telling another witness, "They have no proof against me." In summarising, Mr. Graham, the magistrate, cited Patch's failure to pay his business share, false financial statements, and conflicting behaviour as sufficient grounds to commit him to trial for murder. And so to the assizes at Surrey, where justice now took centre stage. With the courtroom packed to the rafters and the Dukes of Cumberland and Sussex seated alongside the judge, the prosecution began to unravel a tale of deception, desperation, and a man who may have fired more than just a pistol. The trial of Mr. Patch, opening and prosecution. The trial of Richard Patch for the murder of Mr. Isaac Blight opened on Saturday the 5th of April, 1806, at the Surrey Assizes, before Lord Chief Baron Sir Archibald MacDonald. The courtroom was packed early with members of the nobility, county magistrates, and even royalty, including the Dukes of Cumberland and Sussex, eager to witness proceedings. Patch entered composed and neatly dressed. He pleaded not guilty and exercised his right to dismiss 3 jurors. Mr. Garrow, leading the prosecution, opened solemnly. "Gentlemen, I do not come before you lightly. The crime in question, murder, is the gravest on our books. If the accused is innocent, he is amongst the most wronged men alive, and if guilty, as I am convinced beyond doubt, he is amongst the worst." Patch, Garrow stated, had long enjoyed the trust of the deceased Blight, had first hired Patch in 1803 when Patch claimed hardship and offered to work for food and lodging. He was soon paid a salary which increased swiftly. By 1805, Patch had convinced Blight to sell him a third share in his ship-breaking business for £1,250. Patch paid only £250 and claimed the rest would come via a draft drawn on one Mr. Groom. Groom, when questioned, knew nothing of the draft. Patch then substituted it with a personal draft drawn on himself, with no funds to cover it. This deception, said Garrow, left Patch desperate to avoid exposure. The timing of the murder was no coincidence. First shot and suspicious behaviour. On September the 19th, 1805, while the Blight family was away, Patch sent the maid out for oysters. During her brief absence, a shot was fired through the shutter of the front parlour, where Patch had alleged been sitting. Patch claimed someone had tried to shoot him. Neighbours confirmed that they heard the shot, but saw no assailant and no route of escape being made. The house backed onto the Thames at low tide, with deep mud below. The palisades were too fragile to climb, the street was overlooked, and Garrow argued this assassination attempt was staged by Patch to create a false narrative before the real crime. The very next day, when his fraudulent draft was due, Patch wrote to Mr. Blight in Margate describing the supposed shooting, but omitting all mention of the financial shortfall. Concerned, Blight returned to London. The night of the murder. On the 23rd of September, Patch and Blight had tea and grog in the seldom used back parlour, and around 8 p.m. Patch told the maid, Esther Kitchener, that he had stomach trouble and asked for a candle and a key to the privy. He exited through the kitchen, opened several doors, and seconds later a pistol fired. Blight staggered into the kitchen, bleeding and clutching his stomach. "I am a dead man," he said. Kitchener moved to shut the front door, only to hear Patch knocking from outside. How had he gotten there so quickly? Patch helped carry Blight into the parlour and insisted the maid go for help. He did not go himself. Blight was later examined by Mr. Astley Cooper, who confirmed the wound was fatal. When asked for a suspect, Blight said, "Mr. Patch tells me there is reason to suspect one Webster." Patch had previously named Webster, man with a delinquent son, and later suggested a waterman named Clark. No evidence supported either claim, and Garrow argued these were diversions. Patch's conduct and mounting suspicions. After Blight's death, Patch told the widow he had paid the full £1,250 and now owned the entire business. He retrieved legal papers from her that had only been entrusted conditionally. He also attempted to influence the inquest. He instructed the maid to say she had heard him in the privy at the moment of the shot. She refused to lie. Witnesses reported Patch making strange remarks, boasting that he had been as near hanging as ever a man was, and now as happy as I am. Physical evidence. Several suspicious discoveries followed. Stockings, muddy stockings, not usually worn by Patch, were found in his room. The washerwoman confirmed they were his. Ramrod. A clean pistol ramrod was found discarded in the privy, a strange place to hide evidence. The privy soil showed no sign of recent use, contradicting Patch's claim of stomach trouble. Garrow presented a model of the Blight residence and demonstrated that no escape was possible without being seen. No one had been seen fleeing. The only person known to be near the scene was Patch. The Crown evidence. Testimony from surgeons, neighbours and business associates were consistent. Richard Frost, the publican, helped carry Blight upstairs after the shooting. Mr. Cooper, the surgeon, found fatal wounds. Esther Kitchener, the maid, repeated her account of Patch's sudden departure, the gunshot and his rapid reappearance. Sarah Blight, the widow, described Patch's lies and manipulation of business documents. Stephen Groom, named as a lender, denied any involvement. Witnesses confirmed no one escaped or was seen near the property. Patch had motive, means and opportunity. The prosecution rested its case, leaving a damning impression of a man who carefully orchestrated every step, from fraud to false suspects and ultimately to murder. With the Crown's case laid bare, its models, witnesses and web of deception complete, it was time for Richard Patch to offer his own account. Too grand to speak, too cautious to trust improvisation, he chose the safety of the written word. The court held its breath as his statement was read aloud. The defence. Richard Patch submitted a written statement expressing gratitude for the fairness of his trial and the chance to be judged by an impartial jury away from public hostility. He acknowledged the difficulty of mounting a defence under pressure with no legal assistance and without key witnesses, particularly his deceased brother. He argued the case against him was entirely circumstantial, a chain of incidents without direct proof. If any link was flawed by error or motive, he contended, the whole case must collapse. He addressed the three pillars of the prosecution's case. Motive. Patch denied any reason to kill Blight. On the contrary, his future depended on Blight's survival. The business relied on Blight's reputation and contacts. Murder would ruin him. He claimed to have paid over the £1,200 of a £1,300 agreement for a third share and still owned a farm in Devon. Hardly the profile of a desperate man. Opportunity. While he admitted access, he stressed the timing made no sense. Why kill when a witness was nearby and risk immediate suspicion? He insisted he was in the privy at the moment the pistol was fired, and that the slam of the door and the shot were simultaneous, a key point in his defence. Exclusivity. Patch challenged the idea that no one else could be responsible. The door was not locked, the premises were accessible, and alternative suspects were dismissed too readily. He denied any attempt to flee, said he had sought help immediately, cooperated fully with the magistrates. He also argued that Blight's accounts were unreliable, citing illegitimate children, debts, and secret expenses. Patch ended with an emotional appeal, professing his innocence and expressing sorrow for the hardship caused to his wife and children. He urged the jury to weigh the evidence, but also the reasonable doubt that, he claimed, hung over such a circumstantial case. And so the pieces were in place. A tale of two men, one murdered, one accused, woven through privy doors, pistol smoke, and a trail of debt disguised as respectability. As the jurors leaned forward and the public strained for resolution, the learned Chief Baron now rose to deliver his summation. Would the evidence entirely circumstantial be enough, or would Patch's composed performance, his carefully crafted defence, sway the balance? The time for the performances was over. The time for judgment had come. Summation. The Chief Baron now proceeded to sum up the evidence, but before he entered into the particulars, he would explain its general nature and bearing. It was true that the whole case was circumstantial. There was no direct testimony whatever, but when this was connected by a long series of well-connected facts, it was often more convincing than the testimony of a few witnesses to minute and insulated points. The learned judge having concluded his charge, the jury retired for about 20 minutes and returned at 9:30 with their verdict, guilty. Mr. Knapp, clerk of the arraigns, then addressed the prisoner with solemnity, and he recapitulated his crime, the verdict of his jury, and put the usual question: what had he to say why judgment of death and execution thereon should not be awarded against him? The prisoner bowed, but made no answer. The learned judge then shortly addressed the prisoner, told him he had been tried by a humane, upright, and patient jury who, after attending to the whole of the case, had pronounced him guilty of a crime the most atrocious ever known to the laws of this country, a crime commencing in ingratitude, continued in fraud, and terminating in the foul assassination of his friend and benefactor. After what has already been said upon the subject, nothing now remained to him but to pronounce the awful sentence of the law, which was that the prisoner to be taken back to whence he came, and from thence that he be taken on Monday morning next to the place of execution, and there to be hanged by neck until dead. and then to be delivered to the surgeons to be dissected and anatomized. And may Lord have mercy on your soul. And thus ended the trial of Richard Patch. A verdict of guilty, a sentence of death, and a courtroom thick with tension and whispered awe. Whatever the truth of his soul, the law had spoken, and the man once trusted with keys and candles was now bound for the gallows. But before we extinguished the last candle in this grim affair, let us, as is in tradition, turn to a final morsel from the archives. It is, perhaps, less bloody, but no less astonishing. Mr. Patch, through the whole of the awful proceedings against him, maintained a firm composure which was worthy of a better cause. Some people have described this composure as mingled with an air of sullenness, but the general impression was that of a collected mind. He was decently attired in black. He has a florid, healthy look, like that of a man who may be supposed to have chiefly resided in the country. He is about the middle stature, or rather above it, and is round-shouldered. When the dreadful sentence, to which he paid profound attention, was uttered, his resolution was not shaken, except for a single moment at the passage which referred to the dissection of his body. He recovered himself immediately, and his features assumed the same indescribable steadiness of expression. It may be his disposition. He must have suffered appeared after the sentence. Though heavily ironed with irons, he walked firmly and apparently without difficulty from the court to his cell. There was little appearance of pity in his unhappy situation in the crowd that filled the court, but, on the contrary, some persons gave vent to their satisfaction as he retired, in a manner that impressed upon him nothing of pity or sorrow. He seemed to be about 40 years of age. And so the law delivered its judgment with swiftness, gravity, and no hope of reprieve. The jury had spoken. The sentence was death, and all that remained was for the condemned man to meet his fate before the eyes of a public eager for justice, vengeance, or simply a better view of the gallows. But if the trial had gripped the capital, the execution brought it to a standstill. From aristocrats in the gallery to apothecaries in the crowd, all corners of society now turned toward Horsemonger Lane to witness the final chapter in this tale of treachery. From the Northampton Mercury, the 12th of April 1806, trial and execution of Patch for the murder of Mr. Blight. This trial excited a curiosity unparalleled in any similar case. At 6 o'clock, the Sessions House in Horsemonger Lane was beset by thousands. At 9, the court was crowded with many of the first people of the county of Surrey, the magistrates, and some of the principal nobility. Their Royal Highnesses, the Duke of Cumberland and Sussex, some of the French princes, and Count Woronowski, the Russian ambassador, sat upon the bench with the judge. During the whole of Monday, a vast concourse of people visited the prison to witness the execution. The number of applications for admission within the walls of the prison to be present at this awful ceremony had been beyond example. The attempt to obtain a confession from Patch continued without effect till a late hour on Monday, though he manifested considerable alarm in his last communications with the Reverend Mr. Mann. He acknowledged himself as being a great sinner and endeavoured to recommend himself to his protector and benefactor, but at the same time persisted in his innocence. That gentleman informed him that his friends and relations were waiting to take their last farewell, to which he exclaimed, "Is it really to be so? Is no mercy to be expected for an innocent man?" His brother and sister, Captain Toby, his brother-in-law, and his wife, his supposed late wife, and their two daughters were then admitted to see him. He was conducted back to the chapel, where he was pressed, but in vain, by the clergyman and the sheriffs to confess his guilt. On his return, he looked at the people who encircled him with as little concern as any one present. He then beckoned to the executioner, and as he was advancing, he placed his wrists across to be tied, cast his eyes towards heaven, and uttered an ejaculation which could not be distinctly heard. He walked up the stone steps that led to the platform with firmness. When he had gained the top of the prison, he directed a look at the gallows, but did not evince by any change of countenance the least emotion of alarm or contrition. He was again pressed to make a declaration of the justice of his sentence. "I beg of you," said he to the ordinary, "to leave me to myself. I have confessed to that being to whom alone I am amenable for all my offences." He was then halted, and in the course of a few minutes was launched into eternity. Patch was for a few minutes strongly, although not violently, convulsed. A hearse was provided by the friends of Patch to convey his body to St. Thomas's Hospital, where it was delivered to the surgeons for dissection, pursuant to his sentence. The crowd was immense, upwards of 20,000 persons, on the lowest computation. The pressure was so violent that many fainted, and some were trampled under foot. Among the latter were two men, one of whom was so much bruised that his life is despaired of, and the other is much hurt. Further particulars. As we close the sombre tale of betrayal and back parlours, it's time, as is tradition, to lighten the mood with a scandal of an entirely different stripe. Today's further particulars takes us back to the summer of 1777, when one Miss Anne Marrow decided that men were simply not to be trusted, and that the only sensible solution was to become one. What followed was a bold career in romantic fraud, 3 thoroughly confused wives, and a public pillory at Charing Cross that turned into something of a fruit-throwing free-for-all. This, then, is the curious case of Anne Marrow, the bigamist in breeches, a tale of disguise, deception, and a crowd of furious women with a very good aim. From the Newgate Calendar, 1777, Anne Marrow, pilloried at Charing Cross on the 22nd of July, 1777, for marrying 3 women. Anne Marrow was convicted at the Quarter Sessions for the City and Liberty of Westminster on the 5th of July, 1777. On going in men's clothes and impersonating a man in marriage with 3 different women. Mary Hamilton, the reader will remember, played off this trick 14 times and defrauded them of their money and effects. She was sentenced to be imprisoned for 3 months, and during that time to stand once in and upon the pillory at Charing Cross. Agreeably to the pillory part of her sentence, she was on the 22nd of the same month placed in the pillory, and so great was the resentment of the spectators, particularly the female part, that they pelted her to such degree that she lost the sight of both her eyes. And there you have it, a tale of matrimonial mischief, public pillorying, and what one might call an unconventional approach to courtship. If you've enjoyed today's descent into the early 19th century murder and Georgian scandal, consider doing your bit to keep the stories alive by clicking like, subscribing for more tales, most improper, or sharing this episode with a friend, footman, or particularly inquisitive spinster. Or, if your purse is lined and your conscience clear, why not support us on Patreon? You will gain access to more scandal, intrigue, and the occasional improper pudding. The link is below should your carriage not yet await. Go on, confound the algorithm like a well-placed powder puff to the eye. We remain your humble and most unreliable servants. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, certified cravat adjuster, and recently awarded third place in an 1887 National Glowering Championship.